So for those who have joined already, I guess all of you are more or less familiar with Zoom, but I encourage you to put your questions into the chat. Don't hesitate doing this while Sven and Karl are speaking already. We have a little team looking at the questions, and they will be sending me the questions then as far as we can answer. So we have an extra session of 15 minutes after the presentations for Q&A. Make use of your chance to really point your questions directly to either Karl or Sven or to both, and ask whatever you wanted to know about this important subject. Okay, I think we just should be starting, and I just do a very quick kickstart, and then I hand over to our two distinguished speakers today. I have to say I'm really happy about this webinar now happening. It's been quite a journey. I think the longest stretch of the journey wasn't necessarily with F20, but was with Sven and Karl and the engineers working on this global energy scenario and the global general scenario on how realistic it is to keep the world average temperature increase below the 1.5 degrees. And as you know, there's only a certain so-called carbon budget attached to that trajectory. And the question that our two experts today looked into was whether it's possible to really work with this carbon budget that is still available, and whether it's possible to keep the world temperature increase really then below the dangerous benchmark of 1.5 degrees. You may have heard different terms in this context, be it zero carbon or carbon neutrality or 100% neutral or 100% renewable or whatever, but it all ultimately goes down to the same premises, which is how do we control average temperature increase, and how do we remain within this carbon budget. There are a number of good news, who would have thought in the year 2020, but there are indeed a number of good news with big countries such as China or South Korea or Japan committing to a zero or a carbon neutral scenario. For Japan and Korea, it's by 2050. China is committed to 2060. And this is mostly considered as really serious business. So I think there are some good news, but we are of course still far from the trajectory that would lead us to this way. And that it is actually possible. I'd love to only answer with this expertise that we now have in this webinar. And I'd like to quickly introduce you to Dr. Sven Teske, who is the research director at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology in Sydney. He has gathered some 30 years plus experience in modeling energy scenarios, and he has proved to obviously get it right. So I always like to allude to the fact that some journalists had took the effort to look back and look at the different scenarios that were published by a number of institutions, yours, Sven, were always the most accurate. So I think that's a good sign. And we have another expert, who is Karl Burkart, who is the co-founder and managing director of One Earth, and was the man behind making this global scenario actually possible. Both will probably address slightly two different approaches in looking into a trajectory below 1.5 degrees. One is ramping up renewable energy and how to convert the energy sector. And Karl has put a lot of effort into looking in what the natural habitats, but our ecosystem contributes in terms of remaining under this 1.5 degrees, how our global nature actually contributes to this goal. So without further ado, Sven, I would like to hand over to you, and please take us through your most recent findings of this global scenario. Over to you, Sven.
Thank you, and good morning from Sydney. It's 6 o'clock in the morning, so bear with me if I don't speak too fast. I have to wake up. So I'm just jumping straight in. The project scope of this work of the 100% renewable energy scenario globally was to develop a 100% renewable energy scenario and to decarbonize the entire global energy sector within one generation. That means until 2050. Based on technologies we have currently available, excluding biomass, CCS, and nuclear energy. And we had to develop 10 regional scenarios. So it's not just a global scenario, but the 10 world regions, which are usually used from the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook. We look into all sectors: power, buildings, industry, and transport. And we look into the power sector specifically into a 1-hour resolution over the entire year for 2020, 2030, 40, and 50 in order to assess the storage demand and the required interconnections between different regions by electricity, power cables, and also we had to look into non-energy related greenhouse gas emissions. That's what Karl will present. That was about a 1.5-year research project. We published a book about this, so you can download this book for free at Springer, and it's called Achieving the Paris Climate Agreement. And we were working in a team with about 20 scientists from University of Technology in Sydney, from the German Aerospace Center, DLR, in Germany, and the University of Melbourne. The University of Melbourne was focused on the non-energy related greenhouse gas emissions. The model we took were actually not one model, but several. So we did the DLR, the German Aerospace Center, worked on a transport model, which is sort of a bottom-up analysis of freight and passenger transport demand by mode. So they assessed how many ton kilometers and person kilometers we travel right now via plane, ship, train, and road transport. How many and to what extent we use diesel, oil, or electric vehicles. So that's a bottom-up, rather detailed model for all the 10 world regions. We had a resource model, we call that ReSpace, that we have developed in our team, which is a GIS-based renewable energy potential system. So we basically map the entire world and subtract all the areas, all the land use which is already taken and which should be protected, nature conservation areas, but also roads and all the city areas, agricultural areas. So we just assessed what is actually available for utility scale solar and wind. And there were basically 2 inputs into the larger model, the energy system model, which is in the center. And then we modeled bottom up the energy demand for transport, which we basically modeled sort of specifically before, and then all the heating demand and industrial demand and so on. That is basically, that gives us the overall sector coupled answer of how the energy system would look like. We took that out and just specifically focused on the power sector and simulated the power supply with very high penetration of solar and wind in the 10 regions. For that, and then the University of Melbourne had a modeling exercise with all the non-energy related greenhouse gas emissions. So as an input, we basically got the carbon budget, which was 450 gigatons between 2015 and 2050. Just a few little remarks about the renewable resource assessment. It's a geographic information system, as I said, and provides maps for the solar and wind potential. We subtracted all the areas with residential and urban settlements, infrastructure for road, industrial areas, and we still had quite a bit left. So this slide here with the African continent, you see blue would be the available area for wind. If we would show the solar potential, would be red or orange, and obviously the Sahara is huge an area. It's a huge area, but you also see that on the African continent you have a lot of blue dots, but there is not actually so much potential in the center of Africa for wind. So we basically have to change the energy and specifically electricity generation structure by continent, by region, according to the available resources. The assumptions for the long-term energy model is the 5-degree scenario, which is the reference case, is just taken from the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook. The current policy scenario published in 2017, as I said, it's a 2-year project. The IEA stops at 2040 with this scenario, so we extrapolate the next, so the remaining 10 years. That's basically a scenario which has been published. We did not change anything, we just implemented it in our modeling tool. And in order to also calibrate this tool in order to be directly comparable with the World Energy Outlook. Then we developed a 2-degree scenario, which had a carbon budget of 590 gigatons between 2015 and 50, and developed all the energy efficiency and renewable energy driven possibilities and assessments required for a scenario. And then we modeled basically with this carbon budget. And for the 1.5-degree scenario, we had to accelerate the speed in terms of implementation of new renewable energy, as well as efficiency. And we see it as a technical benchmark scenario. So we really squeezed it, we really pushed hard in order to make sure that we remain under that 450 gigaton carbon budget, but on the other hand, we also have a scenario which is technically and logistically actually possible, and that's important for this work as well. The assumptions for the transport model, you see the 5-degree scenario has an enormous amount sort of increase of aviation and cars, while the 2-degree scenario has significant, and 1.5, significant increase of passenger train, which was implemented for the replacement of the continental long-haul traveling. So within Europe, within North America, or within Asia. You can't reduce aviation to zero, obviously, because there is still some intercontinental flights, but the domestic flights have been reduced drastically. Also, we have an increase in car transport as well, but not as drastic as under the reference case. The key results. First, we do have far more renewable energy potential than we need. That's the good news. So we have the specific potential for utility scale solar and onshore wind here, both in square kilometers and in gigawatt. That's basically related also a bit from the technology point of view. For example, for wind, we assume that the onshore wind turbines on average will have in the beginning 3 megawatt turbine size and then upscale to 5 megawatts. And that has an effect on how many turbines and how many megawatts you can fit actually into 1 square kilometer. And that's important. So we have those values for always 8 sub-regions for each of the 10 world regions, or altogether it's 72. So not every continent has 8 sub-regions, but in average 6 to 8. So those examples, those results show us we have a significant potential, and we are the actual availability, the global renewable energy potential, is not a limiting factor to develop a 100% renewable scenario. The energy intensity, which is basically a value which tells us how much energy in energy units, in this case megajoule, we need for each dollar of GDP. And this is an international sort of standard figure where you can compare countries with each other. And we go in terms of final energy from 2.5 megajoule per dollar GDP down to about 1. So we have a reduction of the energy intensity of around 2.5% per year, which is more ambitious than historical values. The historical progress is about 1%. The IEA just put out a press release yesterday that for the first time since, I think it was 2010 or 2013, can't remember, the world actually slowed down in energy efficiency process. We had not even 1%, and that's not good news. The final energy demand for all the, I need to move this thing here because I can't see my own slides. So the final energy demand for the world will go down drastically in our scenario, and that is due to a mix of different reasons. It's not just we not just save energy, we actually electrify a lot, and the final energy the final energy from a scenario which with high electrification will go down significantly, because electric drives are far more efficient than, for example, combustion engines. But also we do have a reduction of traveling of person kilometers by car. We have a reduction of travel kilometers by plane, and we have an increase of efficiency in buildings. So those are the reasons, and there are many more measures to take in order to reduce the overall energy demand. The final electricity demand by sector goes up, and that's obviously due to the fact that we have a lot of electrification going on. We have electric for heating, usually via heat pumps, not direct resistance heating, but heat pumps. We have also a lot of electric drives in mobility in the transport sector, and we have for some applications also hydrogen production and synthetic fuels. The production of hydrogen and synthetic fuels is very, very electricity intensive. And right now, the current efficiency is around 50%. So if you produce hydrogen, you actually lose half of it in terms of the electricity put in. But technically, it is possible to have an efficiency of about 70 to 75%. So we assume that there is an increase over time for the production of hydrogen and synthetic fuels. But nevertheless, we do have a significant increase of electricity demand for basically all sectors. Hydrogen is used for some transport applications like heavy-duty vehicles and also ships or synthetic fuels. We assume that planes will use biokerosene. We have a limited amount of biomass in this scenario. We assume that 80 exajoule per year of sustainable biomass is possible. It's sustainable, but we don't use more than 80 exajoule. And those 80 exajoule need to be used very wisely. And one part is used for aviation, another part is used for industrial process heat, because there are several industrial processes which could not use electricity because a very high temperature level is required. And that's, for example, the fact for the steel industry, but also for the petrochemical or for chemical industry. From demand to supply, now we have the electricity generation. We currently go from about 27% renewable electricity on a global level all the way to 100%. The majority of 100% renewable electricity supply is solar PV, followed by onshore wind, offshore wind, and then significantly less concentrated solar power. We still have a bit concentrated solar power. And also we have a limited amount of geothermal. And even we factor in ocean energy. Ocean energy is relatively minor in this scenario, but nevertheless, I'm a big friend of, supporter of diversity of technology for scenarios. So strictly speaking, if we would only do sort of least cost assessment, cost optimization, we would probably end up with almost entirely PV. The problem with that is that if there's a lot of solar photovoltaic, then we have the requirement for enormous amounts of seasonal storage, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, in North Europe. The electricity, the solar generation will take place mainly in the summer and not in the winter, so you basically have to store it. A better technology mix will not avoid storage requirements, but will reduce it significantly. We calculated the investment cost versus the fuel cost savings. The fuel cost savings are based on the fuel cost projections of the IEA, the World Energy Outlook. And in this scenario, we could actually gain the additional investment in new renewables by a fuel cost savings, more or less. There is, in some regions, in some of the world regions, we had a surplus. So we have actually very higher fuel cost savings than the investment, while others won't have that match totally. But on a global level, we are roughly at plus minus zero. And that's quite conservative because we do not factor in a significant further reduction of some renewable energy costs, especially solar PV. I think solar PV in some scenarios by 2050 is significantly cheaper as what we factored in, but we want to be a bit on the safe, on the conservative side. In terms of transport, we have electrification. We have a little bit biomass, biofuels for planes, as I said, and for shipping, but the majority is electricity. And we do have a little bit of hydrogen for road transport, for heavy duty vehicle, but for passenger vehicles, there is not much on hydrogen in there as well. In terms of the global primary energy demand, we have the 2-degree scenario will achieve 35% renewables by 2030 and 92% by 2050. And the 1.5 degree scenario, 1.5 degree scenario has 40% renewables in 10 years and 100% in 2050. There is one part in the 2-degree scenario, the non-energy use, which is not totally renewable. And that's another subject. I think we could organize a webinar only how to phase out fossil fuels from the non-energy sector, so for the use of plastics and for steel making. But that's sort of not within the scope of this webinar. Coming to the end, global bunker fuels, very important to also assess global bunker fuels. I have to say that in many scenarios, the bunker fuel part is sometimes left out. So that comes on top of it. And we have developed a concept for bunker fuels, which is a mix of biofuels and synthetic liquid fuels. This is all produced via renewable electricity. And we identified 3 regions, Africa, the Middle East, and Australia, to produce those fuels, because those regions have a vast solar and wind resources and also space available. So they can actually produce that, and the bunker fuels are used for international aviation, international shipping. So bunker fuels is everything used in terms of energy which is not within a country limits, within country statistics. CO2, we achieved the 1.5 degree scenario, and we will reduce to only 3 gigatons in 2040. And then the last 3 gigatons will be phased out in the last 10 years of this scenario. I have to say the last gigatons are the most difficult ones, and we are talking about phasing out carbon emissions from some industries which are very hard to decarbonize, for example, cement, for example, steel. And I'm coming to the end with the global power generation structure. We are moving from variable renewables from currently 5% to 65%. So we have 65% of the global electricity supply in 2050, which is variable, which means it's either solar PV or concentrated solar power, or onshore wind or offshore wind. And dispatchable power goes down significantly. So what changes is we have limited dispatchable fossil fuel and no nuclear power plants in the future. And that means that the entire structure of the power system will change. The dominating source will be solar and wind, and everything else will be grouped around it. So when there's no solar electricity, when there's no wind electricity, then we kick in with other dispatchable renewables like concentrated solar power. Integrated storage has a limited possibility to jump in. We have biomass, we have geothermal systems, we have, of course, hydropower systems, and we have gas power plants which use hydrogen or synthetic fuels to have dispatch services, and obviously also storage. The load, the overall load goes significantly up in all regions, because electrification of the transport system means that we will increase the electricity demand. As a rule of thumb, if a country electrifies the transport sector, the electricity demand doubles, and we need to make sure that this electricity actually comes from renewables. Here's the storage overview. All those figures, numbers are available at the book you can download, so you don't need to go into real figures. Just as an overview, we start with a backbone and storage with pumped hydro, which are available already in several regions, and then we increase significantly battery storage, but also thermal storage and hydrogen storage. In summary, it's possible. We don't see any technical or even economic barriers which makes it impossible to achieve a total transition. What we obviously see is we don't have the policies in place in order to do that. And that's not part of this presentation, we actually in this project also looked into employment effects of the energy industry, what happened, and we also looked into the required metals like cobalt and silver and other metals used for solar and wind and battery technologies, and looked into whether or not there is a limit or not. And with this, I described basically in a very short way and very shortly how we reduce the fossil fuel emissions from the energy sector, and that's the black curve, which sort of falls over a cliff on this graph. So that's basically what we modeled. I hand over to Karl, who will run you through the more colorful bits of that curve to see what the non-energy greenhouse gas emissions do.
Please feel free. Many thanks, Sven. If we were in a physical meeting, you would hear the applause now. Many thanks for that. Please feel free to change the host. Excellent. Karl, before you start, one very, very short question with a very short answer, Sven. We know you know all this stuff, but what was the most surprising part in doing this research in the energy element? Was there any particular thing that was really surprised you?
The surprise was basically to what extent we were able to accelerate renewables, and the amount of potential we have for solar and wind when we did the mapping. That was something I actually did not believe. I mean, there is so many, in the first place, there's so many potential analysis. So ours is one of many.
Sure. Okay.
We have done the sort of space constraint, and that we still have enough space, even under very ambitious and strict constraints, was actually a good positive message. I was a bit worried that we don't have enough, but we had enough. That was good.
Okay, many thanks. So for those who have joined a little bit late, what we're doing is here looking into the question whether or not we can remain under the 1.5 degrees benchmark. And we've heard one leg of this endeavor, and that is obviously replacing with technology and existing infrastructure on energy generation with new technologies on the supply side and on the demand side, and bringing energy to places where it still not exists. We heard 500% plus in African countries, for example. Now, the second leg of this effort is to make sure that we don't clear cut our forest and don't decultivate our soils, which would be de facto net emissions coming into the atmosphere in addition to those that are attached to the technology part, to the energy sector. Karl, and you will take us through that second leg of the journey to remain below the 1.5. Karl.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Karl Burkart. As I mentioned earlier, I'm the managing director of One Earth, which is a philanthropic initiative dedicated to accelerating resources to achieve the 1.5C goal. And so as Stefan mentioned, we have the energy piece, but we have the second section of the executive briefing that you guys have all seen, which is really focused on a nature-based solution. So we're going to talk about that next. And this is just a contextual reminder that we're already at 1.1 degrees Celsius in global average temperature rise since early industrial levels. And as you guys have all seen, in 2020, there have been extremely dramatic climate responses to that level of warming already, including rapid melting of polar ice, slew of papers out on that this year, and intensifying forest fires pretty much all over in every continent. So as Christiana Figueres has said, from here on out, every 1/10 of a degree matters. So we're going to really get into some of the nitty-gritty on how we get everything we need. This is a back of envelope little gap analysis we did on what many consider to be sort of a very positive outcome of what might be a positive outcome of the Paris Agreement, which is something around 2.2 degrees Celsius. And a lot of people say, oh, that's not so bad. But you know, we know that at 1.5, we're going to have a lot of effects we want to avoid. So can we get there? And so the blue bar that you see here is Sven's energy transition sort of mapped against that reference scenario, which is, I think, in many people's opinion, probably the most technically comprehensive analysis of how to do that and how fast we can push the pedal to the metal. And we think it's pretty much the fastest. So even with that very, very fast transition that Sven just described, we still have a gap of something like 500 gigatons of emissions that we have to deal with to stay below 1.5. And so that's where nature-based solutions comes in. And in the report, I'm unpacking this in a slightly less technical way. So there's a lot more technical references when you get this. Sorry, that's my dog in the background. There'll be suddenly very interested. There'll be a lot more technical information in the big book, which is 500 pages every year. So we can't afford to lose any of this. Now back to the big composite chart of the 1.5C model in achieving the Paris Climate Agreement. I just wanted to point out the blue and the green at the bottom below the line. That's those terrestrial and ocean carbon sinks, which are absorbing a lot of our carbon dioxide every year. And in the model that was run for this study, it's estimated in this rapid transition that Sven outlined, the natural carbon sinks would contribute something like 480 billion tons of emission removal over the century. That's a lot, but actually they could provide even more. And I just wanted to point out the little, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that little yellow dotted line there, that's actually a very important line in this chart. And what it shows is in the gold areas, you're looking at land use emissions or AFOLU emissions, if you follow the technical term. And those, according to the model, those go net zero in the second half of so somewhere around 2027, they go net zero. But that assumes that we're going to have ongoing deforestation and land use emissions that just very gradually decline towards the end of the century. So that's why that yellow dotted line is gradually declining. Now, if we change that dotted line, we could actually get a lot more benefit from the carbon stocks. And that, I forgot to mention, that dotted line is corresponding to SSP2, which is that gradual decline in emissions. This is just a quick back of envelope. So SSP2 is that blue line there. That's emissions that are expected in potential there. And I think we're going to need that 100 gigatons. And I amended the chart. This, of course, isn't in the paper. This is the post-COVID chart, if you will. And what you can see at the very top of the black mountain up there, that was 2020. So 2019 was the peak in global CO2 emissions. And we were expecting in 2020, you know, a modest decrease in those emissions. Because of COVID, we have a very rapid decrease in emissions. And it actually, that decrease, which is about 9%, I think we'll find out for sure in a few months. That's more or less in line with the model that Sven and the team ran. But of course, we're expecting sort of what we call a second wave of emissions, right? As our economy starts to recover from COVID. And so this is a hypothetical, but if that's going to gradually increase a bit, maybe to about 2025, when we get to hopefully 2025 really becomes our final peak. And before we do the rapid decline needed to get in line with the Paris targets. And that is, that gray wedge there that I added on roughly is about 100 gigatons. So, you know, it's very tight to see that we may be able to do this 1.5C, but if we were to reduce deforestation faster, it might compensate for this delay. And now that we actually have the US back in the game with the Biden administration coming in, there are, hopefully rosier days ahead in terms of global carbon reduction. So that's the conservation piece. That's saving what we have. Now, that's the background, right? We have to do a lot more. We actually have to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and put it back in the ground. So I wanted to show this chart here, which is a paper from a couple of years ago, that looks at the historic losses of carbon from land. And the darker areas have the more intensity of loss per kilometer. And the paper surmised that over the past few hundred years, we lost something like 1.7 trillion tons of CO2 from land into the atmosphere. Now, we know we can't put all that back, right? A lot of this area here is developed. It's cities, it's roads, it's farms. So the question is, how much can we put back? And that was one of the main questions addressed in chapter 4 of the Achieving the Paris Climate Agreement book, which looked at carbon removal potential of land restoration pathways. And here we're looking at the 4 main forestry pathways that are widely agreed in the scientific community. I'm just going to quickly walk through those. And these are stacked, which is a little bit different than how they're shown in the book. What you see here in that sort of bright green wedge is tropical reforestation. So that's really our biggest opportunity. And just below that is temperate reforestation. The authors found something like potential of 300 megahectares of land that could be restored in the tropics, and another 50 megahectares in temperate zones. And taking those together, we could get something like about 220 gigatons of carbon removal from those 2 pathways. Below that, we have another really interesting pathway, which is increasing carbon density through rewilding of existing forests. So that's taking forests that may be partially degraded or could be enhanced with more diversity. And taken together in tropical and temperate, that adds up to about 105 gigatons there of removal potential. The brown bands at the top are looking at benefits from better forestry management. And that amounts to about 155 gigatons of removal. And at the very top, we have trees on croplands, which is about 30 gigatons. So altogether, about 510 gigatons of technical potential in these 4 pathways. So roughly enough to fill that gap that we showed earlier. Now, there is a new paper coming out led by Kate Dooley, who is one of the lead authors for chapter 4, getting a more precise estimate by region on all of the pathways. And here we're just looking at showing you a picture of trees on croplands. And this is a farm in France that has alley cropping, but also expanding to look at trees on rangelands, which is grazing or pasture lands, which is another interesting opportunity. Now, we got to get to the third one really quickly here, because even with that 500 gigatons of removal, that's just taking care of carbon dioxide, right? There are other gases. And chapter 4 is, as far as I know, the most comprehensive assessment of all of the gases. And there are many, many, many more. I didn't even know about half of these gases, but the 2 big ones that everyone will have heard about are methane and nitrous oxide. So these are 2 charts taken from chapter 4. The top one is showing with methane that we have something like a reduction of about half, a 50% reduction, from about 400 megatons to around 200 in the next 10 to 20 years, which is quite rapid, of methane. That's going to be accomplished mostly by reducing livestock, more efficient rice cultivation, a big reduction in food waste, and other measures as well. And one minor point is, as we reduce fossil fuel use, for example, coal is a significant contributor, as is natural gas of methane. So there'll be some benefits, reductions of methane, just from reducing fossil fuels. At the bottom, we have the reduction in nitrous oxide. It's a little bit less. The model calls for about a third reduction, from 7.7 megatons a year to 4.5. And this is accomplished mostly by reducing agrochemical inputs, in particular fertilizers. So you can see here on the pie chart, that's the lion's share of what causes those emissions. At One Earth, we're actually advocating for a bigger reduction of half, because we think and we're going to find out in the next few years, but we think nitrous oxide is probably underreported. So this is just a quick way to frame it for your friends. It's a little easier to understand. Essentially, for the non-CO2, we need to reduce waste by half, and that's emissions from municipal waste and also food waste. We need to reduce chemical inputs to agriculture by about half, and we need to reduce meat consumption by about half. And I just pasted in here this a chart from the Eat Lancet Commission, which many of you will know about. And that was a big scientific effort to analyze a theoretical scenario where if everyone got the proper amount of nutrition for 10 billion people at a 1.5 C constrained world, what would that diet look like? And not surprisingly, it has a major reduction in red meat, and about 1 serving a week is what it amounts to there. If you were to eat according to Lancet diet. Now, of course, some regions are much more already vegetarian or don't eat very much red meat. But in our household, we're already striving to do this eat Lancet diet and have 1 portion a week. Now, I did want to point out that not included in the Achieving the Paris Climate Agreement book, there are other nature-based pathways that there just weren't yet global scale models to incorporate them. But there's a lot of research being done on this right now. In the first one kind of category is ecosystem, other types of ecosystem restoration other than forests, and grasslands, what you're looking at here, and wetlands together could yield something like, maybe around 50 gigatons of removal through the century. There's a very exciting paper coming out next year, hopefully early next year, on ocean conservation and the ability to increase carbon stores in marine areas. There's a recent paper came out just looking at the potential of whales, for example, if we were to be able to double whale populations, which is still far less than their original numbers. We could increase carbon storage in the oceans by as much as 35 gigatons through the century.
Amazing! I didn't know that number.
Yeah, that's just one part of it. Of course, there's many other facets to marine. And then last, we know that there are numerous innovative solutions coming in the agricultural sector that will help us get below 1.5. And One Earth has funded R&D for two pilot projects. One is a large-scale compost application of municipal waste, which you see on the left there in California. And on the right is an example of torrefaction, which is related to biochar. It's except it doesn't require fuel inputs, so it's more for sustainable, appropriate technology. And this is an example in Nigeria where farmers are able to essentially manufacture their own fertilizer by combusting rice waste, and that actually permanently stores carbon in the soil and increases soil structure and fertility. Each of these may be something in the order of another 50 gigatons. We don't know yet globally, and there's a lot of work, research needs to be done to figure that out. But there are other opportunities. So I want to end on that positive note and then hand it back to Stefan.
Many thanks, Karl, for this, and many thanks for kickstarting this work, actually, 2.5 years or even 3 years ago. And now with this 600-page book that really does the math. But ultimately, I think the book tells one thing. Remaining under 1.5 degrees is a decision. It's not, we're not doomed. We're not forced to go beyond that number. We're not forced to go there. We can do differently, and it actually has a number of benefits as opposed to a business as usual scenario. I know it's already 5 minutes to 9 in my watch here, but I have 2 questions that I just want to address to you guys. A very little commercial for F20 in our Foundations 20 group, especially on this aspect of nature-based solutions. We have just launched very, very newly a report with the World Resource Institute on translating this knowledge, what we've just heard, into very concrete recommendations to the multilateral decision-making processes, the Convention on Biodiversity, the CBD, or the UNFCCC, or indeed the G20. So watch out for that and feel free to download it, of course. The first question is on the role of hydrogen. I just want to make sure that I get it right here. The question is, there are a number of recovery packages now coming up, and hydrogen seems to be the new big thing. And then we are having different colors of hydrogen, like turquoise hydrogen or blue hydrogen, or maybe whatever, black hydrogen, whatever. But it seems that everyone agrees, no, not everyone, but a certain part agrees that we need green hydrogen. Do you see this as really sort of matching with what you found in the global energy scenario?
Well, I mean, we do need hydrogen for some transport modes, but more importantly, for some industrial processes. So, for example, if we want to decarbonize the steel industry, the only way of doing that is via hydrogen. So we need it. I'm not a friend of all the different colors for hydrogen. For me, from my point of view, the only hydrogen we should use is hydrogen we produce with renewable electricity, full stop. That's basically green hydrogen, but I never use the colors. I always say renewable hydrogen to make it clear. But yes, we do need it for industrial processes, and less so for cars. But it's probably unavoidable because not every process can be electrified.
Okay. Thanks for that. And I also have a question which I found very interesting. And I come to that from Kevin Sanders. I just come to that in a minute. But before, I just want to sort of remind ourselves that this is the mass, these are the numbers. This is sort of telling us that it, as I said, that it is a decision and not something that we are forced to go this direction or that direction. And a question to Karl would be, do you think this multilateral format, the CBD coming up next year, the COP15 so-called, is this a place where you think this concept of nature-based solution will gain more traction and that it will have a chance to ultimately design a legal framework that really then shifts the investments into something that would lead us to restoration of our natural resources?
That's a great question. I mean, it's definitely gaining steam. When it was quite controversial even just 5 years ago. So just the change in the past 5 years has almost been astonishing, really, since 2015. And I think there were good reasons for that, because I think partially no one had done these big global scale analysis of like how much carbon should we assume we could remove. And part of it was that some NGOs, I think, were rightfully worried that it would derail the conversation from the decarbonization of energy that we have to do, right? We don't have a get out of jail free card with nature-based solutions. That we have to rapidly decarbonize energy, and we have to max out our carbon removal as well. So I think now that is getting to be more commonly understood, and we're seeing a lot more of it. I think, you know, and F20 has that new booklet, the briefing coming out, which is very exciting, on the Biodiversity Convention. And I think WRI and others are looking at the connection between commitments that a country can make in its NDCs for the Climate Convention, the land-based commitments, and how that might map over to conservation and restoration commitments. It's still pretty early days, but I think the frameworks, the UN conventions are sort of creating a space for it. I feel like there's actually a lot of enthusiasm, especially in the corporate sector, on this right now. Yeah. So I think we're going to see a lot of developments in the next 5 years.
Yeah. And hopefully also with regard to the G20, because that ultimately is, of course, also the idea behind our Foundations 20 platform, to really sort of hold G20 countries accountable for implementing what they basically agreed to with the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. And with the Italian presidency on the one side, and with the COP under the presidency of UK, I think we will see a lot of momentum then next year also coming from this to multilateral fora. You can already see that there are, you know, country commitments coming in at the moment. So we should definitely end with this positive note. And the final question, I promised to cover that question, and that would be 2 extra minutes before you go, is to motivating the youth. And I really like that question a lot, because ultimately we hear really the youth standing up, questioning the very ancient principle that parents care for their kids as best as they can, and they don't necessarily seem to be this see this to be the case at the moment. Do you think that these kind of scenarios, or how can we translate this knowledge to those of the, you know, those representatives of the young generation who are basically saying, you know, you're stealing our future? And I know both of you are activists by heart, so I dare asking that question, despite the fact that this is mostly your scientists here. But with all your experience, how can we translate this knowledge that it's actually still possible, and what the next steps are? How can we translate this to the Generation Greta or the Generation Fridays for Future?
I will start. First, a little commercial based on that book, based on that work. We have been asked from the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, from the UNPRI, to develop 1.5 degrees pathways for the steel industry, for cement industry, for aviation, shipping, and so on, for the investment sector. And they will publish that on Thursday.
Oh, so, wow. Okay, you made it.
That's a good timing. And I think I have to use that forum here to announce it. And I think motivation, I think the generation is probably in a very good position right now to use all that knowledge to underpin their demands. And I think they need to have very ambitious demands. They need to push us further. And there's so much research out there that they have all the rights to actually be ambitious. And I think I would just suggest take our scientific work and use it for your demands, and push harder, and push for also more research and development for even more ambitious scenarios and stuff. How do we implement them?
Yeah, amen. I mean, the good news is that this generation, and I guess I'm talking more about the Gen Z generation, the young ones, are so much more educated than when we started.
Oh yeah.
Back in many decades ago. And I was just thinking about the leadership of Fridays for the Future, and they put out a really important declaration a few months ago, I think kind of around September, calling for that they demand a good chance of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the difference, that's actually a very important policy statement, because previously it was sort of a 50-50 chance was the kind of conversation in the IPCC. And they were like, no, we want a good chance, which is defined as 66% or greater. And they had a declaration out signed by hundreds of scientists. And that kind of pathway, really, we're looking at net zero by 2040, which this model is roughly in alignment with. And then I saw Christiana Figueres just recently released the new climate pledge, which is a net zero by 2040. And all of these major corporations are signing on to it in droves now. And so just watching how the youth are now really pushing the conversation forward, I think that's been very inspiring to me. And they're done with the speaking truth to power. They actually want to have the power. And I think I think we're going to see a lot of exciting developments in that next 5 years.
Well, many thanks. Many thanks for this, Karl. Many thanks for everyone who stayed with us, wherever you are on the planet. I'd like to close this webinar now, but watch out this space, watch out the different activities of the partner foundations of F20, of the G20 related activities, the activities related, and translating this to the CBD or the climate conference next year. These are next year really important spots to watch, and ultimately, of course, it has to be implemented by the cities, but that's an important subject that we're going to address next year. So many thanks everyone again. Stay tuned and all the best wherever you are, and stay healthy. Bye bye everyone.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.